In Kenya, debate ignites over the issue of unsafe abortions. Zimbabwean activists find alternative ways to be heard as the government stifles social media. And Nigeria steps up its efforts to contain a Lassa fever outbreak. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening, I'm Esther Gidui. You are in for Vincent Makori. This is Africa 54. Tonight we begin with unsettling news out of Kenya. A debate is heating up in the East African nation about the number of women seeking and dying from dangerous abortions. Abortion is illegal in Kenya unless a mother's life is in danger. The pro-choice group Marie Stopes estimates about 2,600 women die each year from unsafe abortions. But some faith-based groups say women facing an unwanted pregnancy have other options. Raul Ambor reports from Nairobi. And we want to warn you, the content and images of this report may be disturbing to some viewers.
We'll call her Martha. That's not her real name because she didn't want to be identified. Martha was married with 3 children when she got pregnant with her 4th child in 2010. Her husband didn't want another child, so at 6 months, she found a clinic willing to perform an illegal and dangerous abortion.
I started bleeding. I sat in a bucket full of cold water. I was sweating and losing strength. The fetus came out, but now the problem was that the placenta did not. I passed out.
About 500,000 unsafe abortions were carried out in Kenya in 2012, according to a report released in 2018 by the Africa Population Health Research Center, Kenya Ministry of Health, and International Public Sector Accounting Standards, IPSAS. In a country where abortion is illegal except when a mother's life is in danger, backstreet abortions are all too common, says healthcare officials.
We may get 3 to 4 cases in a month, which reaches in our facility. But remember, there are others who die at home, who maybe no one to bring them to the facility.
For the last 30 years, the Sexual and Reproductive Health Organization Marie Stopes has provided a wide range of maternal health services, including abortions. The group says 7 women die daily from unsafe abortions in Kenya.
There are multiple causes for this, including restrictions in the law for safe abortion, and including lack of information by women and girls about where to get safe services. And there's also, particularly for young people, limited access to contraception. And when you have a situation where contraception is limited, there's a stigma around younger people getting pregnant and having sex before marriage.
In November, Kenya banned Marie Stopes from performing services while it investigated claims the group was promoting abortions. The ban was lifted about 5 weeks later after the probe found the claims were untrue. The group says it is trying to raise awareness about unsafe abortions, but some faith-based groups want women to know all their options and help making the right choice.
The issue of choice only considers 2 choices: carry or abort. There are other choices, but people don't always talk about them. There is adoption. How many families are out there are not getting babies and they want children?
They have an unwanted or unintended pregnancy. They're often desperate and they don't know where to go, and no matter what, they're going to terminate that pregnancy. And so they'll do anything to do that. And so often they will go to a backstreet abortionist.
It is a debate and health problem seen around the globe. The World Health Organization estimates 25 million unsafe abortions take place globally each year, with almost all in developing countries. Raul Ambor for VOA News, Nairobi.
Now, across Africa, young people are putting their respective governments and long-time leaders on notice. They are standing up to abuses of power and expressing their disapproval through protests. But at what cost? Africa 54's Paul Ndiho has our report.
In its annual report, Human Rights Watch says violent government crackdowns against dissent shaped Africa's human rights landscape in 2018. Government leaders often bullied peaceful protesters, political opponents, human rights defenders, and civil society organizations, while suppressing freedoms of citizens, and in some cases, killings. For example, in the wake of violent protests over massive fuel price hikes in Zimbabwe, the government imposed unlawful restrictions and bans on peaceful protests.
The reports of serious human rights abuses, including beatings, abductions, torture, and the involvement of ZANU-PF, the ruling ZANU-PF party groups, in beating up people in the high-density suburbs around Harare.
Throughout the region, people were denied their right to peacefully protest through unlawful bans, use of excessive force, harassment, and arbitrary arrests. The right to freedom of assembly was the exception rather than the rule, as young people advocated for democratic values. Doug Ferry, a Zimbabwean rights activist, says that democracy cannot just be about the majority towards those who did not vote for the ruling party.
In terms of democracy, what's important is the balance of power, the institutions. Do we have strong institutions? What can the elected officials get away with? If the executive does something blatantly bad, can the parliament hold them to account and pull them up short?
In Sudan, demonstrations are calling for President Omar al-Bashir to step down continue. The armed government protests first erupted in mid-December over inflation and soaring food and fuel prices. Human Rights Watch says that the protection of democratic values, self-determination, and freedoms are being challenged every day.
If you're an autocrat, it's very convenient to violate human rights. It's the way you stay in power. It's the way you fill up your bank account. It's the way you pay off your cronies. So there are reasons why governments want to violate human rights.
Attacks on freedom of speech are seemingly at an all-time high as democracy is continuously being challenged instead of being perfected, according to Vanda Feller-Brown, a senior fellow on foreign policy at Brookings Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based non-profit organization devoted to independent research and policy solutions.
Having an informed public requires freedom of media, freedom of speech, but it also requires access to media and assets, and it requires that people have the physical space to concentrate on something other than their survival.
Vanda says in some African countries you have long-time leaders exploiting ambiguities in the law to extend their terms in office, while simultaneously undermining the nation's constitution.
Elections, regular elections, with defined time frames, whether it's 4 years or 5 years, are a crucial facet of a democracy. And I would say presidential term limits are a crucial facets of democracy. And it's something that's very much contested around the world, certainly throughout Africa. There has been a lot of movement to abolish the term limits and change constitutions.
As some African administrations clamped down on dissenters, they became more emboldened to attack traditional media and social media too, including blocking the internet and text messaging services. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
Many Zimbabweans are turning to social media to express themselves in a country that has long controlled the flow of information through state media. But during recent protests, the government blocked access to the internet and is warning it will do so again. But as Columbus Mavunga reports from Harare, many are finding ways to make their voices heard anyway.
This 23-year-old economy graduate says he started blogging after having trouble finding a job. Through social media, Treasure Basopo expresses his disapproval of President Emmerson Mnangagwa and his government. He is especially upset that the Harare blocked social media access in January during protests over a fuel hike.
I felt like that was the height, the summit or the crest of oppression in my own motherland. The only people who were tweeting, the only people who were Facebooking when it comes to Zimbabwean issues, the people in the diaspora. People became more innovative. People also resorted to the use of Telegram and the use of VPN.
The VPN, or Virtually Private Network, is a service that securely connects to a server and keeps online activity private. Basopo allowed VOA to videotape him blogging, but asked we not show the location where he uses the VPN service. The VPN allowed him to blog during the protests, even though the government had blocked access to social media. Harare officials defend the action and say the government will block social media again if necessary.
Social media was used by criminals to cause mayhem. This is why government had really blocked social media.
Mutodi went on to warn that Harare will enact a cybercrime law soon to punish alleged abusers. Under the measure, citizens could be charged with the transmission of data messages to incite violence or damage property and jailed for up to 5 years if convicted. Independent political analyst and blogger Rejoice Ngwenya.
Our government is very nervous, very suspicious of social media, and they have a reason to, because they are used to hiding information.
But that debate might spill into courts as President Mnangagwa's administration prepares the cybercrime law on social media. Activist Trevor Basopo opposes such a move.
And democracy entails that people must be able to express themselves, and people must have the freedom of conscience as expressed in Section 60 of the Zimbabwean Constitution.
Mutodi says during the January protests, Zimbabweans used social media to spread malicious and false information and should use it to interact with the government instead. Columbus Mavunga for VOA News, Harare.
We want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. We're also streaming our show live on Facebook, so check us out and share our show with your friends. Still ahead on Africa 54, combating Lassa fever in Nigeria. We'll be right back.
Voices, we're talking about the news and issues you're talking about, sharing stories of development and growth across Africa, around the world, and in our lives. Topics that inform, empower, and change the rules. It's time for Our Voices with me, Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick,
and Hadiza Kiari,
and Ayan Bior,
and Orion Itangi Shaka.
It's time for Our Voices.
It's time for our health report, and joining us now is Africa 54 health correspondent Lenore Mudu to tell us about radiology and domestic violence. Lenore?
Thank you, Esther. Actually, we will talk about measles today. The western U.S. state of Washington is battling a measles outbreak that has affected more than 40 people, the majority of them children. The disease was declared eliminated in the U.S. in 2000, but has since made a comeback that is tied to imported cases and the rise of the anti-vaccine movement. The majority of those infected are children, many of whom have not been immunized against the disease, officials say. Health officials have warned that people infected with the disease had visited areas such as schools and churches. They added the outbreak could still be in its infancy as the incubation period of the virus averages 14 days. Those infected can spread measles to others 4 days before and 4 days after the rash appears. The highly contagious disease can cause severe diarrhea, pneumonia, and vision loss, and ultimately can be fatal.
It's incredibly contagious. You can be in a room If you're susceptible, you can be in a room that somebody with measles left 2 hours earlier and still get the disease. If a person with measles meets a population that's unvaccinated, about 90% of folks are going to get the disease.
The impact of this current outbreak has been pretty significant in our area. Washington and Oregon tend to be somewhat of a region where we immunize less than other parts of the country, and we're seeing the effects of that. Certain populations have been exposed to the measles, and we've had a significant issue the last few weeks. And unfortunately, I hope I'm wrong, but I think the cases are going to get more frequent and spread throughout the country from this epicenter.
According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, at least 10 states have reported cases of measles in 2019, including California, New York, and Texas. The outbreak has renewed debate over the so-called anti-vaccination movement, in which fears about potential side effects of vaccines have led a small minority of parents to refuse to allow their children to be inoculated. Meanwhile, in Europe, more children in the World Health Organization's European region are being vaccinated against measles than ever before. But progress has been uneven within countries, leaving increasing groups of susceptible individuals unprotected and resulting in a record number of people affected by the virus in 2018. According to the WHO's measles data for the year 2018 released Thursday, monthly country reports from January to December 2018 shows that over 82,000 people in 47 countries contracted measles in the European region, causing the death of 72 children and adults. The total number of people infected with the virus in 2018 was the highest this decade. The European Vaccine Action Plan 2015-2020 lays out a strategy endorsed by all 53 member states to eliminate both measles and rubella. At least 95% of every population needs to be immune through 2 doses of vaccination or prior exposure to the virus to ensure community protection for everyone, including babies too young to be vaccinated and others who cannot be immunized due to existing diseases and medical conditions. Now we turn to West Africa, where Nigeria is stepping up its measures to control the recurrence of Lassa fever. Nigeria has begun beefing up its measures to control a Lassa fever outbreak. Health officials say the disease has already claimed the lives of 42 people since January. In 2018, Nigeria recorded the highest reported cases in the history of the disease. This year, the situation is even more severe. Chikwe Ehekwezu is CEO of the Nigeria National Center for Disease Control.
So in the first 4 weeks of this year, we've had more cases of Lassa fever detected. We had 70 cases in the last 2 weeks, consecutively, more cases than during the same period last year. So we're now focusing on the response, focusing on supporting the states that have a higher burden, make sure they're well prepared to prevent, detect, and respond to Lassa in our country.
Observers say Lassa fever is a significant challenge to Nigeria's healthcare system. The disease has become an annual problem for the nation's health officials. The World Health Organization is helping Nigeria contain the outbreak by collaborating with third-party health institutions. In the city of Jos, in Plateau State, 8 deaths have been reported and over 40 confirmed cases have been recorded.
We've galvanized efforts in responding to any outbreak of Lassa fever. We have a very strong team here of specialists in infectious disease who have managed Lassa over the years.
The Plateau State government has started a sensitization and awareness program for health workers and community leaders to prevent the spread. Kaneng Pam participated in the program.
I didn't know that if one has a swollen face, it's also one of the signs of a possible Lassa fever case.
The Nigerian CDC has developed national guidelines for infection, prevention, control, and disease case management to reinforce the measures put in place to contain Lassa fever. And that's our health report for today. To stay in touch, find me on Twitter @LenorMudu. Esther, back to you.
Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, back to you. Esther, ba
And thanks, Lino. Be sure to watch Lino Mudu's reports every Tuesday and Thursday on Africa 54. Now, U.S. allies have given a cautious welcome to President Donald Trump's announcement of a second summit meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to be held in Vietnam later this month. Trump's announcement came during his State of the Union address Tuesday and was one of the few highlights in a speech widely viewed around the world as light on foreign policy. Henry Ridgwell has more global reaction.
Donald Trump announced he will meet North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Vietnam later this month, the latest milestone in what the president claims is a foreign policy success.
Nuclear testing has stopped, and there has not been a missile launch in more than 15 months.
Trump went on to say America would likely be at war with North Korea if he had not been elected president in 2016. But his claims of success in negotiations with Pyongyang are disputed.
There's still evidence that they are committed to their nuclear program.
While South Korea welcomed the summit announcement,
we hope that the two leaders take more pacific and practical actions in Vietnam.
Seoul appears to be taking a cautious approach.
I would imagine that there are many people in South Korea who are concerned at this point that perhaps Donald Trump might continue that withdrawal process and talk about bringing American troops home from the Korean Peninsula in exchange for any nuclear agreement.
On Afghanistan, President Trump repeated his pledge to bring American troops home and pursue peace talks with the Taliban.
Great nations do not fight endless wars.
He also declared victory over Islamic State in Syria.
Today we have liberated virtually all of the territory from the grip of these bloodthirsty monsters.
But the prospect of American withdrawal is worrying U.S. allies, according to some analysts.
As to whether you can really rely on the Taliban to deliver on any peace settlement that might be agreed. Certainly a lot of concern by women in Afghanistan of what that would mean. And again, he's, same line that he's going to pull America's troops out of Syria, and there's very grave concern there about what the implications of that will be for stability in Syria, for ISIS, the threat from ISIS, whether that will grow.
Trump criticized Moscow's purported violation of a Cold War-era missile treaty from which the United States and Russia have pulled out recently. He warned if there is no new agreement, the United States would outspend and out-innovate all others.
It's notable that he was very critical of European leaders, NATO allies, claiming that they've had to be dragged kicking and screaming to pay their share of the defense expenditure, for example, and yet spoke quite warmly of people like President Xi, for example, from China.
With little new in terms of US foreign policy, the impression from afar is that the State of the Union address was aimed at addressing the president's challenges at home. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres travels to Ethiopia this week for the African Union Summit. In part 2 of his conversation with VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bichir, Guterres discusses China's role in Africa and the prospects for peace in South Sudan and the Central African Republic.
Secretary General, is there a conflict or a crisis in Africa that you think can be successfully resolved this year?
Now, we are very committed to a surge in diplomacy for peace that is very much linked, again, with the African Union's initiative to silence the arms in 2020. We have Libya, where I hope it will be possible to have a national conference in which Libyans will assume a new dynamic to find a political solution for Libya. We have an agreement that was signed between Riek Machar and Salva Kiir in South Sudan. Things are going slowly, but they are moving in the right direction. And the conflict of South Sudan has been probably one of the most devastating from the humanitarian point of view that we had in Africa. We have just an agreement established for Central African Republic between the government and the different armed groups, again with the African Union leadership and UN support. I think that the work that we have done together in prevention of conflict, for instance, in electoral situations, in the DRC, trying to avoid a confrontation after, in Madagascar, where things, in Mali, many of these elections take place in difficult political contexts where it's easy to generate after the election a confrontation between the parties, to do everything to avoid it, this preventive action that we are doing together with the African Union and regional, sub-regional organizations is, I believe, giving a very important contribution to diminish the risks of conflict and to progressively find a way to address the conflicts that are still remaining. But there is a wind of hope in Africa. And I think the best symbol for that was reconciliation between Ethiopia and Eritrea. It was an initiative of Ethiopia, of the new Prime Minister of Ethiopia, but we see negotiations between Djibouti and Eritrea. We see a reconciliation between Eritrea and Somalia that already took place. We see in many other areas movement in the right direction, and we are totally committed to work together, the African Union and the African sub-regional organizations, to support this wind of hope, to make sure that the African continent is able to achieve its goal to end conflicts by 2020.
Secretary General, China is now the second largest contributor to UN peacekeeping behind the United States, and they're also playing a very large economic role on the continent. What's your assessment of China's role in Africa?
I think that when we have a cooperation of more developed countries with less developed countries, there are always risks, but it's very important to, and this is the UN's main mission, to work with the recipient countries to make sure that the Chinese cooperation is well integrated in the structure of the country, trickles down to benefit the economy of the country, because we want to avoid, in relation to the present cooperation that takes place, the same risks that we know in many other situations in which big projects sometimes do not fit in relation to the needs of a country. On the other hand, it's very important, everything to be done now in the global context in order to avoid debt to be too large. So there is a lot in which we can cooperate with the recipient countries, with China and with other investors in Africa. Our own objective is to make Africa overcome its difficulties, to make Africa a continent of hope, to make Africa a continent of future, to make Africa a pillar of the world in which we live, not seen as a problem, but seen as an opportunity.
Secretary General, thank you so much for your time today. Have a safe trip to Africa. Thank you.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres speaking with VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bishia. That's our show for today. Good night from Washington.